Good evening for those of you who are watching a pre-recorded version of this. We're starting about 15 minutes early, so if you're watching this, you can fast forward about 15 minutes, and at that point, we should be starting the content with the questions and the answers. So I see folks are beginning to join. I need to admit them in, and I hope you enjoy this and find it beneficial. Hey, man, you figured it out. I'm proud of you.
Oh, man, I just got off of another one. I'm getting to be a pro at this.
Well, you get to be with, you get to be with me on this one, so this one is going to work.
That's right.
No matter what you learn about marriage and annulments, just being with me is worth it. Clayton, how you doing? Can you hear me? Just you and Clayton and I so far, but
okay.
I think we're gonna have about 20 or 25 folks. That'd be good.
Kim.
How you been?
Hey, you sound like a black man.
Close that door. My wife making bad jokes about you.
I know Diane would never talk bad about me. I know you never talk bad about me, so she'd have nothing bad to talk about.
She's heard it all already, huh?
Well, listen, get yourself decent, because I'm asking everybody to kind of share themselves and to kind of share their picture if they are so inclined. Hopefully they are. And we are recording this, so we're gonna.
Oh yeah, let me get that.
So now we're gonna post this. Before I let y'all in, for the pre-recorded folks, I let them know that it'd be about 15. We're getting started off 15 minutes early, that they can fast forward as they're watching this, pre-recorded to get through all of the.
So you recording this one?
I record. You and I recorded, man.
I need to keep my mouth shut then. I'm getting in
I
trouble.
want to see that. I want to see. Hey, Clayton, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can. Thank you.
Okay, good. Very good. Good. How you doing?
Pretty good. Yourself?
Good. I'm going to be letting folks that are coming in here doing real good.
Good deal.
Thanks for joining early, and I think that'll help us get started on time here, and folks are continuing to join. Welcome everybody as you're coming in. We got folks joining pretty quickly here, so that's good. I'm just
Hey, Tim, can you hear me?
I can. Let's see. That was Mark. Is that you? And
No,
Steve, I see you.
that was me.
Oh, George. Hey, yeah.
I actually got my Yankee shirt on, but you can't see it because it's underneath my shirt.
Yeah. I got to tell Luann, I want to warn y'all, we're recording this. So, even early on here, I just like, you don't say anything embarrassing, not that we ever do, but
So how we doing, my brother?
doing good, man. How you been?
Doing all right.
I see you figured out how to put the backdrop in. You're the first one you get the award for that, so.
There you go. That backdrop is the Sea of Galilee in Israel.
Oh yeah, good backdrop to have.
Good to see you guys.
If folks join in, I'm set up. I've got to admit it again. I'll let everybody know I am recording this. I'll talk a little more about that, but just so you know, whatever you say is going to be recorded. So. I think we're expecting maybe 20, 25 folks based on the responses.
Tim, are you going to have any handout that you pass out?
What's that?
Are you going to have any handout to something that you're going to pass out later?
No, we've got, like I said, we'll have this recorded, but this is I think you'll see when Father Jamin gets in, we're basically going to work from the list of questions that were submitted. There were probably about 15 or 20 questions, good questions. And he felt like he'll start with that and work through that and then maybe take questions at the end. So. No, George, it took everything I had just to get this thing organized. Y'all can sit tight if you want to check some other stuff out. It'll probably be, again, 10 minutes. Just appreciate y'all getting on early so we can, make sure we can work through any issues that anybody may be having. So. All right, I'm getting ready to let I'm letting Father Jamin in, so watch what y'all say now. So. Good evening.
Hello, deacons of God.
We are waiting with bated breath to hear your eternal wisdom that you're going to impart on us tonight. So,
Well, hopefully you don't get the burned out version,
That is Kool-Aid you're drinking there, I'm sure, too, correct?
It is Diet Coke. I actually brought the 2-liter in here with me to prove it to doubting Thomases. At a break in the middle of this, it might change to something else.
Depends on the questions.
That's right. Tim, can you make me a co-host so that I can do screen sharing?
Sure. Yep. Okay. Be your co-host now, so you should be able to share.
Okay.
We've got about, I think, 12 of us. We all can count as well. I'm sure we'll have some folks who will join right up to 6 o'clock, so we'll sit tight and we'll promptly get started. Again, I think most of y'all may have heard we are recording this, so that the hope is that we can post this out to the diocesan website under the Deacon Life and Ministry page, and something that you can refer to, something that folks who couldn't make it can use as well.
So that Paul Count can heckle me after.
I'm sure he's going to be the first one accessing this. Correct.
He will. He was curious as to whether or not we were taping this. So.
He's going to critique it, I'm sure, huh?
Oh, of course. As long as we could do it with a martini in hand, I'm cool. Mickey Weber, you're alive. I haven't seen you in a while.
Hi. Am I coming over?
Looking great, Mickey.
I know.
How you feeling?
Doing a lot better. I'll be serving Mass again this Saturday for the first time in 2 months.
Wow.
It's great to hear. Great to hear. Recovered well. I know all of us were praying for you. And,
Thank you.
yep. I just heard the garbage in the street. I don't know how y'all were affected by last week's cold weather, but they're about a week late in picking up trash, so piling up. Did anybody lose power? How'd y'all survive?
Some Senate space.
No, I was
Hey, somebody checking their audio? If you're just joining, we're about 5 minutes away from starting. Thanks for early. And, it's good to see everybody. If you're so inclined, please share your video as well. We'd love to see you. If not, we understand, but can't get any uglier than me. So there we go.
I get into back.
Hey, Jody, I'm not sure if you're talking to us, but you're muted. We can't hear you. I mean, I see your lips moving. You may be talking to somebody else in the room. If that's the case, that's fine.
Yeah, I was talking to Stephen. We were trying to conspire against you guys.
What would a Zoom meeting be without some conspiracy going on in the background, you know?
We were figuring if we have two machines with two different microphones, we could really mess up the audio.
Oh, boy. You know, some people we shouldn't have invited to this, you know, so.
Well, you'll be blessed because we got to jump off at 7 for RCIA. So.
Okay, I've been warned about that, so you only get half the credit. No, we'll talk about that in a second, so.
Senator Long used to say he was against any conspiracy he wasn't in on. So looks like we're all in on it now.
On a lot of them.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Hey, Dan, what you flying, a plane?
Say again?
I say you're flying a plane?
Oh yes, absolutely, Ricky. I can hear so much better with these cheap Best Buy earphones here.
Oh, okay.
We're going to start in just a few minutes. If somebody would like to lead us in an opening prayer, y'all going to hear me speak enough and certainly Father Jamin, but if somebody would like to lead us in an opening prayer, just be thinking about that and I'll give you the cue. If you raise your hand, I think there's a way to raise your hand on here, or just want to let me know, we'll do that in a minute.
So far, I think Clayton has the best wallpaper behind him there, whatever that is.
You can put wallpaper behind it. Let me see.
I'm afraid to disrupt the recording.
Yeah.
It's some sort of
Oh, that's
canned
cool.
vegetable or something. I don't know. Something my bride put back there. So when I taught a couple of classes at LSU, just so that they didn't see the rest of the room.
I want to see if I can do this with this. I got it on the other, my computer at home, and then the studio I got at work also. I want to see if I can do it with this.
I can't pick it up.
Here. Let's see if that's the one I want.
They had some backgrounds you could just select.
Yeah.
I am pleasantly surprised. Nobody's called me on the cell phone as soon as I say this, so.
They don't say it.
Getting in.
This looks like.
We'll give it another couple of minutes. And
It's obvious green screen. It's obvious green screen.
James Morse is on.
Idea.
Or you get the church behind you.
No, watch. See if I can do this. So I'll do like that. It wants to.
When I put my
This is last year's football schedule. I'm selling it real cheap if anybody wants it.
Dan, I can't believe anything that would be signed by you would be cheap, you know, but you must.
I'm afraid to sign it, man. There you go. Look at that. Randy.
Yeah.
That's the championship one there, isn't it?
Yeah, you've muted, so, yeah. Well, listen, let's go ahead and we may have another one or two joining us. Would somebody like to kind of get us started off in prayer? Everybody wants to, but. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and do that, y'all. I get tired of hearing me, but let's begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Heavenly Father, we are grateful for this opportunity to come together. We're thankful that technology allows us to gather. And we pray that the wisdom that you impart through Father Jamin, some things that we can use to better our community, to help those who prepare for marriage, for those who try to reconcile or recover from old marriages and return to the church. We pray that you guide our discussion tonight. Help it be one that the Spirit guides. We ask you to bless Father Jamin as he guides us through this, and just to help us continue to grow as a community of brothers that continue to build the kingdom of God. And we make this prayer in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Again, I want to welcome everybody. Thank you all for joining. I want to especially thank Father Jamin for taking time out of what I know is a very busy schedule to present, I think, very relevant and important information. Again, just I'll make a couple of real quick comments. I'm going to turn it over to Father. But again, if you would, and I think everybody seems to be doing well, mute your phone. We are recording this. So before anybody got on, let the folks who'll be watching the pre-recorded version of this know the first 15 minutes just foolishness, and they can fast forward. But we are recording this, so we'll post that out to the diocesan website, probably to the Diaconate Ministry and Life page. We'll let y'all know more about that, because I think it'd be good to go through. I think the important thing is that if you kind of miss out on something, you'll have the opportunity to go back and see it again, because some of this stuff does get, as you know, pretty complicated. This will, of course, count as 2 hours of continuing education credit. Hopefully this will enable us to be proactive, I guess, in not just marriage prep, but in annulments. I think as we talked about presenting this, we realized a lot of people out there who maybe want to do annulments and won't come forward. Maybe if we're proactive and we see that and we feel more comfortable with it, that'll help advance that effort as well. So, yeah, we do have just the last thing. We a number of questions were submitted. I'd sent out a request. We probably got about 15 or 20 questions. I think the plan tonight is to try to move through those, honor those questions that were submitted in advance, and try to stick to those. And then as we get through those, maybe open it up to others. Certainly, if you have a quick question about the topic we're talking about, I think that's fine, but we're going to try to at least get through all of those tonight. So any questions about how we'll proceed? Okay, well, with that, I'll turn it over to Father. It's all yours.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to do this. This has been long in coming. I know that several members of the diaconate community asked that a similar forum as this happen some time ago. We just never had the opportunity to do so in terms of participation and what have you. But it's really nice to see so many of the deacons that are here to talk about the subject that we're going to talk about. When asked to do this presentation, the two things that came to the front were, can we talk about wedding prep and all the things that are related to wedding prep in the church? And can we talk about some issues related to declarations of nullity, to the annulment process in the tribunal? As Tim mentioned, many of you submitted questions. And when I got the questions in and I kind of organized them in a little bit more of a systematic way, I realized this is going to take the whole 2 hours for me to go through all the questions that you have. So hopefully while we're going through the questions, we'll have a little bit of a didactic to talk about some of the issues and relevant topics related to it. If something's unclear or you'd like to ask further questions, please feel free to use the raise hand feature if you don't mind. And we will take it from there. So if you give me a second, I'm going to do a screen share because I actually put the questions in a PowerPoint form with some entertaining clip art for us to look at together at the same time. So bear with me. And hopefully you are able to start seeing a slideshow in front of you right about now. So I put ask the expert in quotation marks because that's Paul Count, right? I'm just the cheap flunky that works on the side. But these are just some questions regarding marriage prep and annulments that you guys had. So the systematic thing we're going to do and how I organize these is first to talk about specifically marriage preparation and related to that convalidations and sanations. A lot of the questions that came up specifically regards the matter of what is a convalidation, what is a sanation, and when do I use one over the other? The second subspecies, and I was a little bit amazed that there were more questions on the first category than there were in the second category, were annulments and grounds for invalidity, types of cases, and some questions about procedure and practice in the tribunal. And then finally, if we have other time, to talk about other questions if that time permits. So that's kind of the scheme of what we're going to do. And if you're okay with that, we're going to launch straight into marriage prep, convalidations, and sanations. So here is the first set of questions that actually came up, and I can't see the question because your faces are in the way. The questions were these: what civil and ecclesial documents are needed in preparing a couple for marriage? And might some church parishes, maybe even some dioceses, have different requirements, or should there be a standard list? This might blow your mind to begin with, because documentation, in a sense, is not even necessary. Now, let that sink in a little bit, and we're going to talk about why it is necessary on the flip side. Really, all what's needed for persons to get married in the church is moral certitude that the persons have the freedom to be able to marry. How can you prove that is the question. So documents essentially provide the proof that persons are able and capable of getting married in the church. So to do that, what do we need? What are the usual documents that are asked upon for documentation, but to ascertain whether or not a couple or party is free to be able to marry? Well, the first one usually is the Prenuptial Inquiry form. Got that nice new shiny diocesan website, diobr.org. Might take you a little more time to find the documents on there, or I can send you the direct link. But regardless, it's a fill-in form, it's a PDF, and it's a formal affidavit that usually the preparer asks each and every party subject to the marriage about whether or not they're free to be able to enter into that marriage. You've all seen it before. First page is really the boilerplate. Tell me a little bit more about who you are, where you're from. Let me find out where to contact you and how to get you in case I need you. And then the secondary portion of that document is the affidavit. Tell me about your background, your name, your parents. What's your religious identity? Let's ask some of the canonical questions. Are you an Eastern Catholic? Are you free to marry at this particular point? And then ask some other questions that might have some relevance also in the civil forum too, from the perspective of the state. Once that document is sort of completed together with the couple, usually it's signed by the person that's doing the preparing, and it's also signed by each party to attest that what they say is true to the best of their knowledge and belief. And usually it's sealed with the parish's seal. Our form also has on the backside sort of a little cheat sheet, a checklist, if you will, to sort of help preparers in terms of the liturgical celebration, but also to remember some of those civil things that are necessary. Don't forget to tell your couple, for example, to go get their wedding license 30 days to 24 hours before the ceremony takes place. That prenuptial inquiry form, at least in the state of Louisiana, in the 7 dioceses that comprise our province, is usually pretty standard. So if you go pull New Orleans or Lafayette or Shreveport, it's going to look basically the same. There might be a couple of other questions placed in a different variety of places. The coat of arms is going to be different. But for the most part, all of our bishops have gathered together and said, this is sort of the conventional standard. And give some of your candidates credit for coming up with that affidavit. Paul Counts was very instrumental in doing so. And I think it's a really good form, not only to help you to determine whether or not the couple's free to marry, but it also begins to start stirring some questions that are going to be important, I think, in the life of the marriage moving forward that you'll launch into later in prep. So again, is that you have to have moral certitude that they're free to marry. But one of the big documents that's going to help in that regard is the Prenuptial Inquiry, because it asks those feeding questions as to whether or not a couple can marry. There are other documents too. One of them are the Baptismal Records. If you think that the state invented the bureaucracy that we are all accustomed to, you're wrong, because it's all an invention of the church itself, right? Most of you know that your baptism, your church of baptism, is your primary record holder in perpetuity, so that every time a new sacrament is confected, that church where you confect the sacrament is responsible for making some notation that you've received that sacrament. So if you make your confirmation at another church outside the church of your baptism, for example, the church where you make confirmation is responsible to let your church of baptism know. First communion, not necessarily so, and that's one of those big questions that's going to come up. You're going to run into Father Crazy Man who's going to say, no, I need proof that you made first communion before you get married. That's BS. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff, because churches are not required to keep records of first communion. But when we get that new certified copy of a baptismal certificate, if the system's working like it's supposed to, hopefully on the flip side of it, it's going to tell you a lot of things about the sacramental life of that person. Where they were baptized using the Trinitarian formula? Did they make their confirmation? And most especially, did they attempt marriage in the church? Also, coincidentally, we want to know if a male party has been ordained to the diaconate or not, because that could be an impediment for marriage a little bit later on. So those sacramental documents are important because they tell us a little bit about the sacramental life of that person, which is going to have an impact and effect upon the life of the marriage too. Outside of those documents, there are some other more provincial documents, I'll call them, things that are important in terms of the particular law of the place where we celebrate our marriage that you might want to include. That's everything from those prenuptial tests that people take, focus, or the PMI, the premarital inventory, which is usually an inventory that scores persons based upon their responses to determine whether or not they seem to be compatible or not. Again, that doesn't really affect whether or not they're free to marry, but it's going to help you in terms of preparation. Also, you need some dispensation documentation in the future too. As we walk through this presentation, you'll notice that there are all kinds of dispensations that need to happen sometimes, whether it be permissions for mixed religion, dispensations from disparity of worship. If there was a previous marriage, proof of the annulment to show that they're free to marry. All of those are just the documents that are sort of essential in the life of creating a wedding folder. Going back to the principle, though, moral certitude is what's necessary in order to make sure that a couple can marry freely in the church, but knowing that we need the documents to help us out. So don't leave this thing saying, Jamin said, I don't have to have any documents in my folder. I just want to give you the canonical standard and then sort of the why of what we do and why we do it, if that makes sense. Now, the question about some parishes having different requirements or a standard list. There are, of course, particularities and peculiarities that happen in churches that don't necessarily impact and affect the validity of the marriage, but are essential if you want to get married in that church. For example, you might have different agreements about what you can and cannot do in the sanctuary. A lot of these are just based upon good wisdom and experience from folks who do this often. We don't want insurance liabilities. We want a good, reverent, holy celebration of the liturgy. And most of the other requirements, if you will, are usually related to the liturgy and not necessarily to the substance, to the celebration of the marriage itself. if other churches have some other requirements, if you will, that would impact the actual celebration of the sacrament, I would question those and to see why they're there, what it looks like in the first place. Now, remember, if you're doing weddings outside the province, if you're going to other dioceses, forms, documents, they're going to look different naturally. And sometimes there are some additions based upon civil responsibilities in a particular jurisdiction. You might remember in the past, we used to do what's called publishing the banns of marriage. Anybody know of any reason this person shouldn't get married? Speak now, forever hold your peace, sort of thing. Those are still required in some civil jurisdictions. And oftentimes a priest preparer, deacon preparer would have to still engage in that in some way in order for that particular marriage to happen in terms of the civil law. But in terms of church law, canon law, there just has to be certitude that the person is free to marry. That was quite a long answer for 2 questions. Is that okay? Okay, moving on. Wedding Prep 101. Don't you love this pretty little artwork that we put in here too? It was my free time, find Bridezilla stuff. They get more creative later. Questions that came up regarding wedding prep were these. Do permissions and delegations need to be granted before a prenuptial inquiry, a P&I, is considered complete? Somebody mentioned that the form implies that they should. Again, remember the form is a guide. The form is helping you to ascertain whether or not a person is free to marry. And a person might not become free to marry until the dispensation is actually granted. And you might not be competent to give that dispensation in the long run. So don't look at the form as being some type of governance document. Rather, I think it's just a guide, a tool to help you along the way so that you know what are the composite parts that need to be addressed before you actually engage in marrying a couple. Here in the Diocese of Baton Rouge, for example, permissions for mixed religion and dispensations from disparity of cult, they happen on a ground level. You have the permission, you have the faculty to be able to grant those things, but that's not so in every single diocese. So oftentimes when you're in another diocese, a priest or a deacon might be engaging the couple in marriage prep. They realize that there is an impediment that needs a dispensation, and they have to go to the legitimate authority in order to get the dispensation. So I wouldn't even look at this question as whether or not the P&I is complete. I would look at the whole question, whether or not am I able to freely marry these people on the day that they requested based upon the evidence that I have before me. And if you don't have the necessary moral certitude to be able to marry those persons, then of course you can't, you shouldn't. The second question is for convalidation. In terms of the testing, if you will, that we use, the infamous test, focus or refocus, and the question for sanation, focus or refocus. We're going to talk about what convalidation and sanation is in a little bit, but this is sort of Marriage Prep 101. These inventories are really to help the preparer as the third person, and then the couple, I think, together to determine what are some of the issues regarding marriage that they haven't talked about before they've come into the celebrant's office. I always tell people, if I had my way, people getting married would be just like priests. They'd have to go through 6 to 8 years of preparation before they could get married, make sure they pass all the different tests and whatever. Usually these are young people that are coming out of their relationship and they might not have a clue what marriage itself is. So this focus or refocus tool is going to be really to help those persons understand marriage. I think in terms of which one you use, and for those of you who might not know, focus would be basically the instrument used for those people who have never been married before, sort of first-time marriage. Refocus would be something that persons could use because they've been married at least civilly for quite a while, or maybe they've experienced marriage before. And there are all types of iterations of these tests for the divorce, for people that have lost a spouse, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's a pastoral judgment which one you use. There are couples that I've worked with that have been civilly married for 10, 20, 30 years. They've seemed to have lived a decent conjugal lifestyle together. However, their marriage is invalid because it lacked canonical form or some other reason. But aside from those solemnities and formalities, it seemed to be a pretty successful marriage. I don't know that I would use the focus tool on them because they've kind of been living out a really good marriage for quite a long while. It might be appropriate to use another one. Some of those circumstances, you do have some discretion to also dispense. whether or not you even need some of these inventories, right? Because they might not be essential based upon the couple that you have and what's going on in their particular marital life at the time. So I know that's sort of scattered all over, but I think that you really have to look at every single couple that comes before you, every single situation, and treat it uniquely and independently. It's almost like we treat persons in the RCIA process, right? You wouldn't want to give this blanket idea of this is what RCIA is about, because every person's different. Every person has a faith life in some sense before they even approach the church to convert. And you want to venerate that and sort of pick that up. If you've got a guy that's come to Mass for 30 years and just never become Catholic, you're not going to treat him the same as random non-baptized person off the street that thought your church was pretty, and now they all of a sudden decided they wanted to become Catholic. Same's true when it comes to marriage, right? Not every single couple is the same. And I think you have to look at that based upon the pastoral situation that you find yourself in. Here come the weird ones, awkward, throwing some chickens up in the marriage. I mean, it's a wonderful clip art there. A question came up about the prenuptial inquiry. If you read it, it does seem to be geared toward engaged couples, and questions are a little bit awkward for those who are already civilly married, who've attempted marriage. The question is anyone working on a questionnaire for those who are now civilly married and want their marriage blessed? And the answer is a big resounding no, because of how the church looks at those particular marriages. Most of the time, the couples that you are going to encounter that are already married civilly have at least one Catholic party that's privy to the marriage. And as a result, they've been living a lifestyle that's not in concert with what the church understands and teaches. We're going to talk about sanation and convalidation again in just a few moments. However, the church looks upon that marriage as being totally invalid until the contrary is proven otherwise, until there's some intervention that could sort of fix the marriage. Convalidation is going to be a total new act of the will, and the sanation is a healing at the root of whatever solemnity might be missing. So in that way, when a couple comes before you and they say, hey, we're civilly married, Deacon, what do I do? Well, you got to massage through that. What I do pastorally is not change the form, but when asking the questions, simply venerate the fact that you understand that they've been living together, that they have attempted marriage in the civil forum, and that they're there to get it right with the church, if you will. I don't think this is a time to use over-empowering canonical language to whack them over the head. It's a time for evangelization, right? And as such, I think that you just have to change the wording in those questions to reflect their situation. For example, it's going to ask one of the questions, are you or your fiance, do your parents agree with your decision to get married? Well, that's a good one you can change. Did your parents agree with your decision to get married to that person civilly, but now also canonically too? But remember that what happens in terms of the marriage, in terms of convalidation and sanation, is going to greatly impact what the church believes and thinks about that particular marriage at that time. And you'll see that a little bit more when we talk about convalidations and sanations. I guess it's a little bit awkward. It's like bride and grooms throwing raw chickens into the sky. Let's talk about this one, permission versus delegation. And this one sort of bridges both wedding prep, but it also sort of moves into the form of the tribunal, if you will. What's the difference between permission and delegation? I guess maybe one of the things to start with is good old layman's understanding of church law. As a pastor, I have permission by the law to marry my subjects in my territory. And if I don't do those two things, if a couple is not marrying in my parish, or if I'm performing or witnessing the marriage outside of my jurisdiction, then one of those two things is going to be necessary. Permission usually is to allow a couple permission to marry outside of the confines of what would be considered to be their demographic parish, their geographical parish. Permission is not for validity, it's for laicity only. So if you forget, but don't forget, deacons, because you'll be castigated by the people in the chancery if you do. If for some reason permission is not given by one of the party's pastors, but the marriage still takes place, the marriage is still valid. Delegation is the one that you need to be much more careful about. In the Diocese of Baton Rouge, in our particular law, of course, pastors possess the faculty to be able to witness marriages in their own pastorate, in their own territory. Parochial vicars assigned to that particular parish also possess that same authority. What's interesting about deacons is that here in the Diocese of Baton Rouge, you do not possess that delegation. So what that means practically, no matter where you are, even if it's your assigned parish, you have to ask your pastor for delegation to be able to be the celebrant at every single wedding that you do. There can be no blanket delegation. It has to be a case-by-case basis. And remember that one of the canonical principles in the code early on is for an act to have juridic effect, it has to be written, which means that you have to have some written proof, deacons of God, that you received delegation to witness a marriage. Now, what does that look like concretely? Paul Counts will tell you that I'm a little bit more obsessive than some people. I like the formal letter exchange. So if I'm going to go do a wedding, say at Holy Ghost in Hammond, you better believe I'm going to write a letter to Father Robert saying, it's my intention, with your permission, to go ahead and witness the vows of couple A on this date at Holy Ghost. I hereby ask your delegation. And hopefully I'm going to have another good obsessive compulsive pastor that's going to respond, "Dear Jamin, yeah, wonderful. You have my delegation to witness that marriage." Those things will be stored nicely in the prenuptial file and be kept at the parish where the wedding is to take place. You don't have to be that formal even necessarily. And one of the benefits of having that prenuptial inquiry form that we were using as a guide to help us out to determine whether or not somebody's free to get married is that nifty little cheat sheet on the back that has all the blocks that you need to check off. One of the blocks mentions is the person delegated to witness the marriage. So all you have to do is get the pastor of the place to simply sign off on that block to show that you're delegated to do so. There has to be some type of written proof, if you will, for juridic effect to show that the marriage, actually, the delegation actually was given by the proper party at the proper time. If there are good records that are kept in churches too, the fact of that delegation should also be made in the sacramental register, specifically in the marriage register for the place. So for example, if Deacon Bert or Deacon Tim were to do a marriage here at St. Margaret, they would have to ask my delegation. They would have to have some written proof, whether that be a letter from me granting it or writing it on the prenuptial form. And you better believe that when I would record the wedding in our sacramental books, because I do them all here, it would actually be written in the notation side that I gave Deacon Tim delegation to witness this marriage on this date. So let it be written, so let it be done. That's a big, big question and gaffe, I think, in terms of the life of our local church that has taken place for quite a while. Oftentimes in the tribunal, we'll look at that when the paperwork comes in to say, deacon wedding. Let's see if the deacon did his job or not and actually got delegation to do this. I know it seems like a legal loophole, but it's important because it affects the validity of the marriage itself. So in essence, remember, deacons, you have to get written delegation in order to witness a marriage anywhere that you go, in your parish and other parishes outside of the diocese. And permission is usually just for one of the Catholic parties to get permission from their pastor to have the wedding outside of their home parish, outside of their home church. The same is true in other dioceses as well, right? I mean, you've got to jump through the prenuptial hoops that the diocese sets forth, because most of our dioceses have a program of what marriage prep is supposed to look like, but you also need to make sure that you get the proper permissions and the proper delegation in order to do so. Also, is a formal letter necessary? And I think I answered that question. Not necessarily. However, written proof of it has to take place in order for us to be able to see it. So I'm going to stop. Deacon Jody, if you want to unmute yourself. So you got a question.
Okay, so in my experience, quite often the pastor approaches the deacon and asks us to do a wedding when it is a Catholic and a non-Catholic getting married. My sense of it is that him asking me to do the wedding is a delegation of authority in and of itself. Now, I know it's not written, and I know it's not formal, but it certainly is tacit. It seems to me that there's probably a lot of weddings out there, and I hate to admit this, where I did not get a written delegation and did the wedding because I was asked to do it by the pastor. In every case where I went to another parish and did it, I always got delegation, but never when the pastor asked me. Is it something that we should go back and document if we can figure out that there are some of these out there?
So what I would recommend is this. Marriages are putatively valid until the contrary is proven. Unless there's some glaring ones that you really know of, those can be later sanitated, right? I don't know that I would open up Pandora's box in that way. But moving forward, know that getting that permission written is of the utmost importance. And part of that thing too, I think Jody's right? In tacitly, you think, okay, Father asked me to do this. He's tacitly given me his permission to go ahead and take care of it in the parish. But in 20 years, when we're all dancing around singing ding dong, Deacon Jody's dead, he's not here anymore, we don't have to deal with him. And one of his marriages come before the tribunal, right? How are we going to know whether or not Father Eric tacitly gave that permission to him? We won't unless we have some written proof of that, right? So that's why I think that it's important, especially in terms of thinking of invalidity, that you have to have those. And I said 20 years, maybe I meant 60 years, right? Where we dance around the campfire.
Father, not Father Eric, but how about Father Paul Counts?
What about him?
Since I was at the cathedral for 6 years, 5 with him.
Yeah, let's hope he doesn't come back and watch this presentation.
I don't think he ever asked me to do any.
You should have paid one of your brother deacons to ask the question, Jody, and not yourself. Or it should have done a hypothetical here, you know? So is that okay for delegation? I know that one's kind of a sticking point for a lot of folks. And again, let's just not pay attention to the past. Let's look forward to the future. Some type of written permission for you to do the wedding in terms of on the prenuptial form or even an exchange a letter, I think is of utmost importance for direct effect. And look, don't be surprised, deacons, y'all aren't the only ones. Priests are pretty bad at it too, because oftentimes they forget to do some of these things as well. So you're not alone. Then comes the question, I got another chat that came up. Let's see. Deacon Sam sent a little message in the chat box. It seems to me that there was a time deacons did not need delegation if they married someone in the parish in which they were assigned. And that could well be true. Speaking of our current particular law right now, though, that is not true, and it hasn't been for quite a while. There have been some pastors who thought, well, I verbally delegated them, so everything should be okay. But they forget the old written principle that's been enshrined in the code since the 80s. For juridic effect, an action has to be written. So I think that's important. Let's talk about senations and convalidations, because that's one of those squirrely ones that have popped up. I love senations, but I'm a bureaucrat. Cleo Milano once told me that I'm taking away the joy of the liturgical celebration from these couples by doing it. And he might be right. But I think there's some other important canonical issues to deal with in terms of senation so that we can understand what it is. So the questions are, in preparation of a couple for convalidation, under what circumstances should the couple receive a senation as opposed to a convalidation? And under what circumstances is a senation not permitted? So let's talk about both of them. Common layman's terms, right? Couple's going to come plop in the church, going to come plop in your office and say, Deacon, I want my marriage blessed, right? That's what they always tell you. They don't know the legal jargon necessarily. They don't understand what the implications of these two means of sort of fixing their marriage is all about. What they do know is that there has to be some intervention in order for them to be able to receive the end of what they're thinking of. And usually that's for them to participate in full communion in the church, right? To be able to receive the Eucharist again, because they know something is irregular in terms of their marriage. The way I look at convalidations and sanations is this. Convalidations require a new act of the will on the part of the parties. So it's as if you're looking at their marriage, which is an attempted marriage, right? It's usually, it's a civil marriage. They married on the beach. They wanted to go to Vegas. Bella Baton Rouge was a lot nicer than St. Margaret Church, whatever the case might be. And they decide to celebrate their marriage somewhere else. They usually come to you because they wanted blessed, and they realize that by marrying outside of canonical form, they realize their marriage or their attempted marriage is not really valid in the church's eyes whatsoever. A convalidation would mean that you, as the celebrant, their pastor, whoever the case might be, would have to drag them into the church, and you would perform the ceremony anew, go through the vows as if they had never been married before, because it requires a new act of the will for them to fully and totally give themselves as the church intends them to do so, which would mean you'd have witnesses to that occasion, all the formalities and solemnities that accompany what a marriage would be. It's basically you're doing the marriage for the first time in so many senses. Now, you'd also need the documentation that a civil marriage did take place and that this would be a convalidation of that attempted union. However, from the theological, the canonical perspective, a convalidation means that they're using a new act of the will to simply say, what I did civilly was basically hogwash, and now this is actually intentionally what I'm doing in terms of marriage. Senations cover a whole lot of sins. And what I mean by that is a senation can be used to fix formalities that people don't really know weren't observed. So for example, Deacon Bird, he forgot to get delegation from his pastor. So instead of the pastor, retroactively going put a letter in the folder, he gets it sanated, right? He asked the competent authority, the deacon just forgot to go ahead and get this done. Can you rectify that? Sanation means healing at the root from the Latin, right? So you're basically going back to the exchange of consent when it happened and fixing whatever the formality that wasn't observed actually is all about. That can happen in terms of a total lack of canonical form as well. It looked like marriage, smelled like marriage, everything was there, except they were bound by ecclesiastical law to get married in front of a priest or deacon, and they didn't do that. When I ask couples the question about whether or not they were free to marry, did they intend marriage as the church intends it, with all those necessary bona attached to it, with the goods of marriage, most of the time they're going to say their civil attempted marriage in their mind was marriage. And so in my mind, they're positively saying, I am not going to go through a new act of the will and once again posit consent, which would be the actual consent. I tend to sanate a lot because a sanation for me is I think legally where they need to go in terms of the church's mindset. Most people, when you tell them that a convalidation requires a new act of the will, they're going to ask you, what the hell are you talking about in the first place? And then secondly, you're basically telling them, hey, look, your consent that you exchange when you go in that church with me, that's marriage in the church's eye from then on. They're going to question that, and they're going to say, I don't know if I really want to do that. Everybody's a little bit different in terms of it. I know a lot of priests that have done more convalidations. Actually, most priests do convalidations and not sanations. I tend to do the exact opposite because I'm a bureaucrat and I like paperwork, and it's a lot easier for me to do so. Remember that sanations usually go and are directed to the bishop, and then the bishop has delegated certain persons to be able to grant that sanation. I'm one of those persons, as is Father Tom Renzino. So usually one of us would be the person that actually would grant the sanation, and then we take it from there. I see I got another chat coming in. Let me see what the question is. Can a sanation be done without the couple's knowledge? Great question. And yes, it can, especially in terms of those formalities and solemnities. I would be very reluctant to grant a sanation for something that just lacked total canonical form and you feel like you need to get this fixed because you really just need to get it fixed. Sanations should really be able to handle those issues that the couple thought were being taken care of behind the scenes, but for gaps of knowledge or forgetfulness or whatever the case is, they just didn't happen. An undispensed impediment, for example. They approached you, they were ready to get married, they knew everything was supposed to take place the way it was, and you're just a boneheaded deacon and you forgot to dispense them what they needed dispensing for. So in that way, yes, that sanation can take place behind the scene. I would be, again, very reluctant that, couple Joe on the street, they just married at the Belle of Baton Rouge, and now they need to get it right with the church, but they really, one party doesn't want to do that. Not only does one party not want to do that, grandma wants to do it, and the party doesn't even know that it's happening. I wouldn't go ahead and do that whatsoever, right? This should be really to help a couple regularize their union in terms of the church, if that makes any sense. Okay. And now the PowerPoint stopped responding. Oh, there we go. All right. So convalidation versus sanation, I told you what the difference was basically. But if a couple were married civilly prior to receiving a declaration of nullity for a prior marriage, what factors would determine whether a convalidation or sanation would be required? I think the simple question, again, to ask the couple is whether or not they intended marriage as the church intends it before the civil attempted marriage actually happened. And that's going to help you determine whether convalidation or sanation is the route to go. There are some factors where you cannot sanate the marriage because it lacked canonical form. Usually those involve divorce and death. To paint a picture of it, I'd have to do a little flow chart for you, but in essence, if a person dies before a declaration of invalidity would come in and remarriage happens before that death, that would be a subject of convalidation and not sanation. Don't want to complicate that. We could talk about that on the side if you want the little flow chart to see what that looks like and why. But there are a couple of occasions where a convalidation would be the norm, the necessary part of it. Think of it this way. If a person got a divorce, they didn't get the annulment, the spouse died, but before the spouse died, there was another marriage entered into, that person would not be able to really tell you exactly what was happening with that marriage, right? And the second attempt at marriage would have happened when the spouse was still bound by the first attempt at marriage. Therefore, you'd have to get consent anew, convalidation and not sanation. It's a little thorny, but hopefully that can explain it. What about necessary permissions? If a couple is married in a Catholic church that is not their home parish, is documented permission from their home church pastor required? The P&I has the question was suggested. And again, that's going back to that documentation. For validity, delegation is required. For lascivity's purposes, permission is required. You should have some type of documentation of both. Remember, in the Diocese of Baton Rouge, at least, we have the same form for mixed religion marriages as we do for disparity of cult marriages, right? So the same form is filled out, and it should be filled out in terms of those dispensations. But for permission, I think it's pretty easy. Everybody's got a stock letter in the cabinet somewhere, right? Change the names, fill in the date, stamp it, sign it, and send it to the church parish. I know here at St. Margaret, we actually have kind of a permissions letter. It's fill the name in, check the box for whatever it is, okay to be a sponsor, can get married outside the church, whatever, sign it, stamp it, deliver it, pretty easy. And I think most pastors can understand that and can easily produce that. I hope they can. Here's an interesting, before we move on, got another chat question. Would this be the same for a sanation, need permission from the home pastor? Sanations are a little bit different, remember, because a sanation is going to ultimately heal at the root the problems of the marriage. Again, most of the sanations we see at the chancery are those that totally lack canonical form. Catholic bound to get married in front of a priest or deacon or have that dispensed. They didn't, but got married on the beach. In those cases, really the only thing that you have to do is prove that they were free at the time of consent to exchange consent and convince the chancery, the bishop or his delegate, that that is the case. I've seen in some of the sanation pacts, and one of these days I'm going to, in the clergy communique, say, this is what we need with sanations and this is what we don't need. One of the things that often accompanies it is dispensations from you guys from different impediments outside of canonical form. Well, what's a sanation? Is healing the problems of the marriage at the root. So if a person married on the beach, but also there was a dispensation from disparity of cult that was needed when we sanate or heal the marriage at the root, not only are we going to take care of the canonical form issue, we're also going to take care of the issue with disparity of cult, the undispensed impediment. Makes sense, right? That the persons with the authority to be able to do that are going to clean up whatever the problems, the issues are in the marriage. So no, you don't have to have those proper permissions, if you will, because remember with the sanation, the fact of the civil marriage has already taken place, and you're not going to go back and say, does so-and-so have permission to have their marriage sanated in the church? So no, you don't have to have those same documents, but a good question. Can I celebrate? This was an interesting one. I know the proper dispensation allows a Catholic to be married in another Christian non-Catholic church. So I'm assuming the question here involved the dispensation from canonical form, right? But does it also allow a priest or deacon to officiate at such marriages? Oftentimes we will get requests for a variety of reasons that a Catholic be dispensed of the requirement to observe canonical form in his or her marriage. And usually that's in a case of a mixed religion marriage. Let's back up a little bit. Two Catholics, according to church law, can never be dispensed of canonical form. So Bobby and Susie are getting married, but they want to get married on the beach and they don't want to get married in the church. There cannot be a dispensation from canonical form. Now, if you're thinking this through, you're asking the question, but then they can come back and sanate it a little bit later. That's a whole other question that we can talk about at some other time. But from the get-go, they cannot be dispensed of the observances of canonical form if two Catholics are getting married. Just put that in the record book. So two Catholics come to you, they say they want to get married on the beach, tell them no, they can't. Well, they take that back. Let's back up a little bit. They could get married at the beach if their diocese allows them to get married at the beach, but with proper canonical form. The dispensation from canonical form, though, again, usually happens when a Catholic party wants to marry a non-Catholic party and do so in a non-Catholic church. That could be because the party is heavy-duty non-Catholic, the family's non-Catholic. In a lot of the religious weddings like Jew and Catholic, it could be a little bit awkward for a Jewish person to come in and celebrate the wedding. There are a whole variety of reasons that people request it. Typically when that happens, it's allowing the Catholic party to participate in a marriage ceremony without the benefit of canonical form. However, there are times that the Catholic celebrant is invited to participate in that ritual. What does that participation look like? Hopefully it's usually just saying a prayer or being present and vested in the sanctuary of that particular church. But if a dispensation from form happens, the cleric really should not be doing the officiating of the marriage. That undermines the whole purpose of what the dispensation is all about, right? The dispensation from form is, well, I really don't want to observe canonical form because there's some interreligious question or some other controversy that's forcing us to get married in a place outside of our own. So my answer to that one would be a simple no, you can't celebrate. Can you participate in an ecumenical way? Sure. Just be careful of what you do and how you do it when you participate in those. Okay. Trying to get through the slideshow. Stuck again. I think the Surface tablet's like on fire. Okay. Or what about this one? Can a priest or deacon officiate a marriage between two baptized non-Catholic persons in a non-Catholic church? No. No, I don't know what the reason would be for even attempting to do that, but I don't want to even go any further. No. You should only be marrying Catholics in Catholic buildings or mixed religions in Catholic buildings. What happens if you fail to obtain permission or delegation? And the question of invalidity and illicity come in. What's the difference between the two, and can an invalid marriage be made valid by sanation? Some of these are a little bit repetitive, but I guess the big question is, what is invalidity and what is illicity? Validity is at the very substance of the juridic act, right? So if a action is invalid, it really is causing some harm to the substance. Licity has to do with lawfulness. Is this particular marriage following the norms of law? remember that there are a variety of different laws in the church, right? There's merely ecclesiastical law, but then there's divine law. There's some laws that don't change. There's some laws that can constantly change. Validity gets back to the heart of the matter. And if an action is invalid, it really means that there's something in the substance of the act that's really lacking. Laicity is going to revolve around all those typically merely ecclesiastical laws that are important for Catholics, but don't really affect the substance of the act. In terms of marriage, just think about what we just talked about in terms of dispensation from disparity of cult versus permissions for mixed religion. Getting to the heart of the matter, because in church law, a Catholic marrying a non-baptized person is an impediment. It's still in the code. However, Catholics can marry baptized Christians. They're all part of the Church of Christ. They're just not part of the Catholic Church. And there just needs to be some necessary permissions in order for that to happen. The first, validity is affected because if you have an undispensed impediment, it's hopelessly invalid. For the second, well, it just again goes to the laicity, the heart of the matter. Is it lawful for you to do this or not? Again, I'm sure you remember your canon law class and Paul Count scolding you a couple of times just because it's illicit doesn't give you carte blanche to go ahead and say, oh, I don't have to worry about it. It's just a matter of laicity. Only worry about matters of validity. You want to be good deacons that follow the laws of the church. And remember, if you don't follow the laws of the church regularly, there can be the intervention of an ecclesiastical superior in that case who can correct the issue and perhaps affect your capacity to be able to witness marriages, a la the bishop. What about dispensations? And these are some questions in general. Is the same form used for mixed religion cases and disparity of cults? So let's talk about, again, particularly in the Diocese of Baton Rouge. In the Diocese of Baton Rouge, it is the same form, downloadable on diobr.org. You guys have done this before. So if you have any case of mixed religion, person baptized or not, you're going to fill out the same form. Disparity of cult's important because it affects validity. Mixed religion affects laicity. Regardless, you should fill out the form. What should happen with that form? Well, you should keep the original in the copy of the marriage file. But then also, if you read the form in its entirety, it says, please remand this to the chancery and send a copy of it. So make a photocopy and mail it to the chancery right at about the time that the marriage takes place so that we can record it and keep it in our files there. Remember, though, deacons, that you have permission to give that dispensation to parties subject to you, meaning people who have territorial domicile or quasi-domicile in the Diocese of Baton Rouge. This is an important sticking point because in matters of validity, oftentimes people might not be able to dispense, and therefore it could be an invalid dispensation. This is especially true in the border areas of the diocese. If you live in Point Capee, Tangivahoa, down the bayou, and you have a lot of people that come from the different dioceses into your diocese, beware, because you might not have the faculty to dispense. Say, for example, here at St. Margaret of Scotland in Albany, everybody loves that beautifully new renovated church. Brides are just dying to come and get married over here. So all these New Orleanians are like, I don't want to get married in the trashy city of New Orleans. I want to go to Albany where the pastures are greener, and I want to get married there because Deacon Tim and Deacon Bird are just the best deacons, and one of them are going to marry me. Deacon Bird and Deacon Tim, if the parties were both domiciled in the Archdiocese of New Orleans, and one of them happened to not be baptized, would not have permission to be able to grant the dispensation for those two parties because they don't live here in the Diocese of Baton Rouge. And if they did, it's an invalid dispensation. And if that happens and it ever comes to the tribunal, we are going to pick on them religiously and get that couple out of jail for free in so many senses. It happens a little bit rarer, but it can happen nonetheless because there are a lot of persons that cross within territorial competencies, and you want to make sure that when you're dealing with a couple. So remember, your permissions to be able to dispense of disparity of cult and to grant permission for mixed religion only take place for those persons who are here in the Diocese of Baton Rouge. The second question, what's the difference between the two? I think we talked about that. Mixed religion is for a Catholic who marries a baptized person. And by baptized person, we mean somebody validly baptized using the Trinitarian formula. Disparity of cult is a Catholic marrying someone who's not baptized, whether or not they're quote unquote Christian or if they're Muslim or Jewish or Buddhist or whatever the other religious affiliation might be. If a dispensation is not requested, is the marriage simply illicit or invalid? Well, it depends on what it is. If it's a dispensation, yeah, it's probably going to affect validity, right? So dispensation from disparity of cult. Permission for mixed religion is merely that, a permission, so it's only going to affect licity, and it's not going to affect the validity of the marriage. Who can approve a dispensation for mixed religion, disparity of cult, and canonical form? Again, in the Diocese of Baton Rouge, persons who are pastors, who are parochial vicars, who are deacons, and those people with legitimate assignment as assigned by the Diocese of Baton Rouge typically do have those permissions. If you want to check out exactly who has them, grab that old Pagellan policies and look at the faculty pages on the back side, and it'll tell you broken down into categories who has what permission to do what. Dispensations from form are different because no priest or deacon usually possesses those. Those typically end up at the chancery level, and the bishop or his delegate give dispensations from canonical form. Right now, to my knowledge, the only persons that possess that outside of the bishop are Tom Renzino, myself, and I believe Paul Counts actually still possesses the permission to dispense from canonical form. But again, it's a chancery issue. Those have to make their way up to the diocesan offices. Who can request a dispensation? A priest or deacon, the bride, or the groom? Typically, those dispensations usually happen in terms of clergy. I guess it's a little bit of semantics. When you have a couple in your office, technically, you're going to tell them that they have an impediment or there needs to be a permission, but you're the one that's going to grant it. So, I mean, we could get in semantics, who's requested and who's asking for it. The bigger question is when you have a couple that's outside of your competency and they come within the territory of Baton Rouge. Usually it's best for a cleric to talk to the competent party who can grant the dispensation. I'll use an example. We had a question that someone wanted me to go in and do a marriage, which was, it needed a dispensation from canonical form, which I wasn't happy to do because I was the person being asked to do it. So we were going to do it with canonical form, but they wanted to do it at a venue in New Orleans, and they at least needed a dispensation from disparity of cult. They were both from New Orleans, but they wanted me to go into New Orleans to do it. Ergo, I couldn't do the dispensation from disparity of cult for them. I actually had to get the intervention of the Archbishop of New Orleans. So write a letter, cobble it up, tell him why, and send it to him, and then he has the faculty to be able to do that. So those types of conversations usually best happen between cleric and chancery, between cleric and the competent authority that has the permission in order to be able to do so. What lack of form would require a dispensation outside a Catholic church, a non-Catholic minister? I'm not sure the substance of that question, I guess. Remember that a lack of form case simply means exactly what is said. The Catholic party was bound to observe canonical form and they did not. Presupposes that the marriage already happened. There are also defects of canonical form where something that's essential to the celebration of the sacrament might not be there. For example, delegation. There's no proof that the celebrant got delegation. I think the question here again has more to do with a dispensation from canonical form. And dispensation from canonical form will require the normal dispensations actually take place. If you have to give, for example, a disparity of worship dispensation, that should accompany the request along with the premarital paperwork to the chancery. And then the chancery would make the decision to issue that dispensation from canonical form. Again, these are some very broad questions, and every single marriage is a little bit different. So we might have to look at a particular situation to say what is necessary and what's not. One of the things that Miss Mary Lehman and I, Mary Woodruff now, and I have committed to the Chancery is to hopefully maybe give you some checklists and forms, some reviews in terms of the clergy communique about what's requested and what's not. We want to make this less complicated and easier for you. Because if we don't, you make our job more difficult by not giving us what we need. We have to constantly go back and ask for it. So in terms of senations, in terms of dispensations from form, those are some of the things that we might give you some little checklists for in the future that might be helpful for you in terms of figuring out and navigating these waters in the future. It's 6:58. Do y'all want to take a little quick break, move around a little bit, stretch? Why don't we do that? Why don't we take like a 5-minute break? I've got on my watch 6:58, so say 7:05. We come back and we'll continue on journeying through these, okay?
Father Jamin, can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, this Deacon Chauvin. Got an observation. We started off this discussion about whether deacons in the diocese needed specific delegation, and you explained that. In my opinion, maybe one of the sources of that confusion might be the wording that's on the prenuptial inquiry itself. I don't have one in front of me, but I recall, and every time I look at it, I thought, ooh, that's opening up a can of worms. Maybe that statement in the prenuptial inquiry ought to be reworded. There's a statement in there, I think it's on the page where where you have all the blocks and they ask you the questions is kind of a cheat sheet, kind of a page. One of the questions says something like, if you are not assigned to that parish, do you have delegation? Which sort of implies that if you are assigned to that parish, you don't need delegation. And maybe that ought to be reworded.
It's a good observation. Thanks for that.
Yeah, anyway.
Yeah. No, that's great. We'll take Paul Counts to task. You know, one of the non-best kept secrets is that we do need a revision of our Pagellan policies, right? Our particular law, because it's a little bit dated. Some things have changed, and there might be some other innovations coming from the bishop's office soon in that regard. So it could be a fine time for us to re-examine the what and why. You know, perhaps one of the things that the bishop could consider even in the future is granting that particular permission to deacons, so that you don't have to request a delegation. Variety of different ways that we can skin a cat, as they'd say, right?
Yeah.
But thanks for that. It's a good observation, Sean.
Thank you.
Deacon Dan, I see you got a question.
Yeah, just as an aside, Father, are deacons still reminded that they have to register with the clerk of court in their respective civil parishes to be, quote, ministers of marriage?
Yeah, so we would hope that they are. So a little public service announcement. Remember that by the laws of the state of Louisiana, when you're ordained, in order for you to officiate at a wedding, you have to register in one. You don't have to register in every single
right?
Right, but you have to at least go to one of the parishes, counties of Louisiana, in order to do that. I remember when I did mine back in 2006-07. I went to Point Capee, where I'm from, and they pulled the old book out from 1840 something and signed on the dotted line. They didn't even ask for ordination proof because they knew who I was and they knew that I had been ordained. So kind of an easy breezy situation to go through. And it's a good question that Deacon Dan brings up, because remember, other jurisdictions aren't like ours. So when you go to other states, you might want to know what the civil implications are for deacons and pre-celebrants of marriage. Some of them require that you do nothing. Some require, like we do, that you register in a clerk of court, a clerk of register. When I was in Washington, D.C., it was very interesting. The District of Columbia, they're known for their inefficiency. They actually had one place where everybody could get their break tag. So if you lived in the district and you're registered in the district, you had to go to this one place. So that meant people camped out at 3:30 in the morning to go get their inspection sticker because of the inefficiency of the city. But in terms of marriages, if you are not a resident of the district and registered to perform marriages in the District of Columbia, you had to re-register every marriage that you celebrated, which could be quite cumbersome.
Yeah, wow. Did they charge you to do it? Be interesting to know.
They didn't. Not at the time, they didn't.
Yeah. Thank you,
But
Father.
it was painful enough to have to go back and forth.
Yeah.
Okay, let's kind of crank back up to work through some of the other questions that we had. This one was a very interesting one, and I think this might be one of the knock your socks off questions, is the question about sacramentality versus natural marriages. A marriage between a baptized Catholic and an unbaptized person takes place. Is this a sacramental marriage? Or does it become a sacrament when the other party is baptized either in another church or in the Catholic Church? It's a really good question that has somewhat of an effect on marriage prep, but has also some implications in terms of dissolution later on. Remember that sacramental marriages are marriages between the baptized. It's really just a question of sacramentality in terms of their baptismal status. I don't want you to think about sacramental marriages in terms of marriages being celebrated in the church, because those are two totally distinct realities. If two validly baptized Baptists get married, and they do so in their Baptist church, or if they do so even with the justice of the peace present, they have a sacramental marriage. Interesting. Natural marriages are between anybody else who's not baptized. So perhaps a baptized party and an unbaptized person, perhaps between two unbaptized persons. Those are merely natural marriages. That's going to have an impact later on in terms of dissolution of marriage, because you've heard of Pauline privilege cases, you've heard of Petrine privilege cases. Certain things begin to crank up based upon whether or not a marriage is sacramental or marriage is natural. Remember, church law says that sacramental marriages are by their very nature indissoluble. Natural marriages, though, can be dissolved. Maybe not by you and me, but by the competent authority that has the permission to be able to do so. So whenever you hear sacramentality in terms of marriage, the only thing that I want you to remember is if two validly baptized persons marry, it's a sacramental marriage. Now, the other caveat that you throw in there is that for Catholics, there are formalities and solemnities that have to be observed. Namely, they have to be married in front of a priest or deacon or have that otherwise dispensed. However, sacramental marriages are between baptized persons. So to the question about if a person marries a non-baptized person, does it become a sacramental marriage if the second person who is unbaptized later becomes baptized? And the answer is yes, it does. Now to the other column, what and how should this later baptism be recorded in the sacramental registers in the parish where the marriage occurred? I think I know what the question is getting at, but let me go about it in a different perspective. Typically, this involves persons who are involved in the RCIA process, right? So that when a person enters the church, the fact of their marriage, whether it was sacramental or natural, should be recorded in the sacramental registers, whether that be in the baptismal register of the church or in the profession of faith, full communion book that some parishes might ultimately keep. If a party's Catholic and a secondary person marries them who's not Catholic, I don't think later on that when the person ultimately gets baptized, you need to go and make an amendment in that particular sacramental book, if you will. It's really more of a question for the party who is converting and who's becoming a Catholic. What notification should be sent to the Diocese of Baton Rouge and to the church where the Catholic spouse was baptized? Again, I think these are questions that are much more related to the RCIA, and maybe we could just stop there. And I see Deacon Tim has his hand raised. Deacon Tim.
Yeah, let me unmute myself here. So just to be clear, a dispensation for disparity of cult only makes the marriage valid. It does not make it sacramental. Then.
That's correct.
Okay. That was it. Shortest question I've ever asked.
Shortest answer you ever got, too.
Thank you.
Okay. Going to move on. Oh, I got more hand raising. I knew this one would get a stir out of everybody. Let's see. I've got Minus, Deacon Minus.
Yes, in the case of the Catholic, shouldn't there be something that shows? Well, I think you just, sorry about that. I think I just answered my own question. I was thinking about sending off to the baptized Catholic, but they're already in a valid marriage.
Yeah,
I guess the investigation would happen if that marriage ever became necessary to be dissolved. It wouldn't be allowed for Petrine privilege if it became sacramental.
That's correct.
Okay.
If the party was baptized, right.
Right. Once the party is baptized, it wouldn't be eligible for Petrine privilege.
Hey, Kristen.
I got another question. Sure, you're welcome. That came in the Rite of Marriage, Chapter 3, is the order of celebrating marriage between a Catholic and a catechumen or a non-Christian. I'd have to go pull that out, but yeah, I'm assuming that's correct in the ritual book. Basically, in the ritual book, what it does for those particular marriages is it changes the language, right? So that you're not talking about these couples who have been already baptized, et cetera, because you actually have a mixed religion marriage. I think that's the question you're asking. I'm not exactly sure. We're okay with sacramental and natural marriages? Okay. And I'm just waiting on the slide to change. demons have taken over my computer at St. Margaret. There we go. Petrine privilege. So using some of those facts above, should it break up in the future, could this non-sacramental valid Catholic marriage be eligible for Petrine privilege under the right conditions? I think that was sort of what Minus was getting at in terms of his question. To not complicate the different types of annulments that take place, remember that there are various species, and you have to look at every marriage independently to figure out where it goes. We have what are called documentary cases. Documentary cases are basically looking at a marriage and saying that we can prove invalidity just through the use of documents. What would those be? Legamen would be a perfect example, prior marital bond. If you can prove that a person was bound to another marriage but still attempted to contract marriage to another party, you could do that by documents, typically, everything from marriage licenses to affidavits and things of that nature. That suffices in order to prove invalidity. Lack of form cases are not annulments. All they are declarations that marriages didn't exist in the first place, right? They totally lack canonical form, therefore they're not even marriage in the church's eyes. We do that in Baton Rouge. We actually make you decree those through the tribunal because we want to make sure that our deacons and priests are doing due diligence in terms of preparing. But in a lot of dioceses, if a pastor or deacon notices that a person was married previously, but it totally lacked canonical form, you check the box and sort of move on. But that's not true here in the Diocese of Baton Rouge. Then you have those species of more formal cases to deal with. Most formal cases typically involve a whole myriad of different folks where a documentary case isn't necessary or there isn't a total lack of canonical form. In those formal cases, you can have normal formal cases that are heard by our local tribunal, but there can also be Pauline and Petrine privilege cases. Pauline privilege cases, remember, involve the unbaptized, and one person is preparing to be baptized with another marriage sort of waiting in the wings, if you will, whether that marriage has taken place already or will take place sooner than later. Petrine privilege cases typically involve natural marriages, and it requires that there be a non-Catholic party that is subject to the particular marriage. There are also some other little litmuses about who is responsible for the marital breakdown, et cetera, whose bridges that you have to cross. I'm not going to talk too much about those because I think that's a little bit more internal tribunal working 101. I'll say this, though. If you have a Petrine privilege case, it's usually easier just to go about and do a standard formal case in our local tribunal, because by the time that we prepare it, send it to Rome, and it comes back, we could have already done that in Baton Rouge and taken care of it ourselves through another process. So it's rarer that we use Petrine privilege cases. And I don't want to speak on behalf of the judicial vicar, but I think that we typically discourage the use of these. Pauline privilege cases, especially in the more non-Catholic areas of the diocese, can happen, and with some degree of frequency. But most of the cases we deal with tend to be documentary cases or tend to be standard formal annulments that we process through our tribunal. Question about null senations. Can a radical senation be declared null without a formal case? I'm not going to get into the nitty gritty of that, but if a person didn't have the permission to actually sanate the marriage, well, sure, it's not a valid sanation, right? He couldn't wave the quote unquote magical wand across it. And there can be some other opportunities where you can prove that there was a question of invalidity that was skipped over. You remember I mentioned way back with sanations, the questions about would a convalidation be essential at this point, or a sanation because of the timing of marriages and involving divorce? That could be one of those particular ones where a sanation might not be, it didn't heal anything at the root, if you will. This is moving more now into annulment land and some of the questions that people had in terms of helping and assisting people that need annulment cases. It's a question about the interrogatories or the questionnaires that we have. One person noted that petitioners have indicated their witnesses believe that the questions asked of them were too much, that we ask questions that the witnesses would not know. What determines the questions that are asked? Well, let's talk about witnesses first and foremost. We need some type of way to corroborate what's going on in terms of the testimony that comes before us in the tribunal. And typically the way that we do that is through witnesses. If you've helped a couple along and you've gotten the petition form, you'll notice that we usually ask for 4 to 6 witnesses that knew both the spouses, and they also knew facts about the marriage at the time of courting, dating, and the subsequent marriage itself. I think that's the important thing that you have to work with couples so that they can help in preparing these interrogatories. If you got Joe Witness who's known one of the spouses the past 5 years of their life, but don't know anything about the fact of the marriage at the time of consent, that really isn't helpful for the tribunal, isn't helpful for that particular couple in helping us to prove invalidity. So I think the big thing that you have to do first is coach those persons who are going to be the petitioners and respondents in marriage nullity cases, that the witnesses that they provide should be people that knew both of the spouses pretty well, and that would be able to tell us about some of the fact of what led up to the marriage consent itself, and then maybe even some subsequent stuff afterwards. That's what we really examine, right? When we examine a marriage is what happened at dating and what happened at the time of the marriage and immediately thereafter. Now, lots of times marriages last for years and years and years, and all kinds of bad things happen. I call that the smoke that points back to the fire. We don't dismiss that stuff, right? Because oftentimes it's an indication of invalidity. What are the roots at the very beginning of the marriage itself? We need to look at the smoke that points back to the fire, but it's important for us to know what the fire is and to have people that can say, oh yeah, I know that situation, I know that couple, let me tell you a little bit more about it. When witnesses are named, cases submitted to the tribunal, the judicial vicar looks over the case, and eventually he sets the grounds of the particular case. He informs the parties that the case has been accepted. He also tells them what particular grounds we're picking. It's typically at that point that interrogatories or questionnaires are then sent to the witnesses. And we do it based upon the grounds that are determined to be the most sufficient grounds at that point in the life of the case. So the questions that we ask are specific to the grounds that we think we're looking for in terms of the marriage case. How do we set grounds? Well, based on the testimony that's sent to us, right? And it could be testimony just of the petitioner. Sometimes there could be a co-petitioner or the respondent may give testimony at the same time. But based upon the story of that marriage, that's how we determine this seems to be the most apt ground or grounds for us to go with. And those are the questionnaires that are subsequently sent out. Now, if you've worked long enough in the tribunal with us, you know that sometimes when testimony continues to come in, the ground that we originally picked might not be the best ground. And you know that case sponsors or advocates, especially who work with these particular petitioners and respondents, can always petition for a change of ground somewhere within the context of the case. And that can happen because we might see that the testimony is moving in a very different direction. So the questions, should the questions asked be specifically targeted to the grounds? They are specifically targeted to the grounds. So the question that I would have is, again, about the substance of the witness. Are the witnesses named by the parties themselves the best witnesses in terms of that particular marriage case? Why is the case sponsor not copied on request to the witnesses? Part of that has to do with the role of what is a case sponsor and an advocate. In the past, we called those persons that helped people in our tribunal advocates, but advocates in the code actually have a specific duty, or you're supposed to, in some sense, represent, take the place of, and even argue in favor of the case that's being lodged before the tribunal. We've learned over time that unless you have a certain degree of professionalism and understanding of the law, that can be cumbersome, difficult, and oftentimes people just don't do it. So when Pope Francis made the changes to the annulment process in Mediis Judex, which has been about 5 years ago now, I guess, we made the decision to simply change the name of the persons who are assisting in our tribunal, to not make them or call them advocates, but to really call them what they're doing, case sponsors, right? The people that are guiding, helping them along, milling out the information and submitting that testimony to our tribunal. So in that way, if we call you a case sponsor and your job description really is just to assist a petitioner or a respondent in culling up the information that the tribunal is asking for, there's really not a need to copy the witness questionnaires to the case sponsors. That's more of an internal function of our processes at the tribunal themselves. What alternatives are available if witnesses don't reply? Well, again, every single situation is very unique and different. So I can't speak using very huge stereotypes. I can say a couple of things though. Usually there are witnesses that are available. Sometimes petitioners and respondents are just difficult and they don't want to tell you who those witnesses are. Or those witnesses just are lazy and they simply won't participate in the forum. The ones that get really difficult are the ones that the marriage took place 50 plus years ago and everybody's dead, except the people that are coming to the tribunal. Those can be a little bit more difficult. And typically what we'll do is ask for more character witnesses and see if there's any other records in terms of maybe documentation in the prenuptial folder, or some other things that could help us prove the case along. Sometimes those are just downright difficult because there's not enough corroborating evidence. And when that happens, that could be sort of a dastardly thing in the life of a case. I'll say that, and again, using a stirring generalization, cases that last for 50 years and then all of a sudden people decide to get an annulment for whatever reason, usually kind of points back to some psychological issues. You got to be a little bit crazy to stay in a marriage that long if you're that miserable, with glaring problems that could have been happened at the time of consent, but for whatever reason you didn't leave. I find that the marriages that are quote unquote the longer ones are the ones that people kind of realize that they're in a bad marriage almost from the very outset, but they end up having kids and they decide that they're going to be miserable together for 20 years until the kids get out of the house. And then when the kids are out of the house, well, that's when annulment time comes. Those tend to be our longer cases, if you will, but occasionally we get the 50, 60, whatever, how many years ago that the person got married, and those can be very difficult. We just have to use the few resources that are available. What Pope Francis did do in changing the process was sort of change the burden of proof in a sense, that it's not as, it doesn't have to be as complete, I guess, as it were in the past, that we can rely a little bit more upon the testimony of the parties themselves in moving toward moral certitude, but we have to have some corroboration in terms of what is said and why it's said. And now into the sea of the unknown. Deacon Grant raised his hand before we go on. Deacon Grant, tell us what you got.
Okay, so here's my question. When we have a priest or a pastor or someone that does an affidavit for a person, doesn't that lessen the burden of the witnesses?
It does. I mean, to a degree, right? The pastor is saying, yeah, I know this person to be trustworthy, and this is why I know this person to be trustworthy. So that can help. That can surely assist. However,
but it doesn't nullify witnesses, I guess.
It doesn't nullify witnesses, not at all.
Okay.
But it can help in the standard of proof, right?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. What information can be left blank or unlisted as unknown on the annulment form, such as the religion of the respondent, baptism of the respondent, etc.? I love this comment. We put down unknown for the religion of the respondent, but Count said we have to know. And Paul's right, because we want to know completely everything that we can, because oftentimes on those petition forms, we might stumble across something that might make the case documentary and not formal, which can help make your life and our life a whole lot easier. Just that one question, what's the religion of the other party? That's very important to know, because it helps us to know if it's a sacramental marriage, if it's a natural marriage. It could also help us know if there are questions of canonical form in the particular case, right? Because oftentimes the tribunal hears cases that are not just for Catholics. RCIA time, you got a lot of people that come before you with a whole variety of religious issues, and some of those things are important. Sometimes there are things that are just simply unknown, and if you can't put it, I mean, putting unknown I think is okay, but I think it's best to document your attempts to try to find out all this information as best you can. Typically, you're going to be dealing with the petitioner, and the unknown stuff is going to be from the respondent. If a petitioner tells you there are things about themselves that are unknown, stop, take a chill pill, and tell them they're probably lying to you. About the respondent, that can be a little bit more difficult, right? Because oftentimes a marriage will break down, they forget things, they try to run away from the relationship and some of the bad experiences that they had. But oftentimes, my experience, a lot of people know some of this information. I did, there was one case that we have like the woman at the well at St. Margaret every so often. This is the man at the well. He came to us, he had 6 prior marriages. He was married again. This marriage that he was in, the civil marriage, civil attempt, was successful in that they had been married for almost 35 years. If you went back and listened to his story about his marriages, it made total sense. First one, he was married, he was in the military, he was overseas. She cheated on him from the day that they met to the day that they divorced. So he got out of that one quick. And then he developed an alcohol problem. And basically every other marriage after that was looking for love in all the wrong places. Let's just leave it at that. The final marriage was successful because when he got married, he stopped drinking. Now, to find all the information about those 6 spouses, that was tough because there were times that he didn't even remember his wife's name. And to try to mill that information out was a little bit difficult, but we did everything that we possibly could to get what we could. And it's amazing, if there's a will, there's a way. You can find a lot of stuff and find a lot of stuff quickly. Don't be opposed to using the power of white pages and Google searches and things of that nature, because you can find a lot of people and find them really well. And if you don't, and you tell us a no, we're going to go ahead at the tribunal eventually and question that and go look for it ourselves. And don't be one of those boneheaded priests or deacons that say, oh, I don't know anything about that. And 5 seconds later is revealed to us in a Google search where the person lives, what the person does, how old they are, social security number, birth date, et cetera, et cetera. You can find it. It's easy. I'll try to get the PowerPoint to work again. I think my computer is like going to explode. Oh, there we go. Respondent participation. Interesting question. Does the respondent always have to be contacted, even if physical or mental abuse could result, or if the relationship between the petitioner and respondent is very bad? I once had a case where the petitioner withdrew his case because of the flack that he received. Tribunal knows that oftentimes these marriages that we're dealing with in retrospect are very difficult. And there's a whole variety of different things that are going on that are out there. Remember, these are contentious cases. So even though it might not look like it, when they're telling the story of the marriage, the petitioner is ultimately alleging something to the tribunal, namely that they want their marriage, they want to receive a declaration of nullity because of whatever reason. They don't know what the reason is, and that's what we tease out in the tribunal. But we have to allow the other party of that marriage to be able to give their side of the story, if you will. They have to be able to participate. Now, there are things I think that we can do and we have done in the past that if we know about physical abuse, mental abuse, et cetera, that we can mitigate the damage so that there is no damage. For those of you who remember, we used to do a lot of hearings at the tribunal, and we would never actually schedule them back to back. So we wouldn't hear the petitioner's side first and the respondent right thereafter. We would schedule them at different times so they wouldn't even come in the same building at the same time. There are cases that we've had before where one party did not want the other party to know where he or she was living at, because if they did, there was a potential that there could be some retribution. And there are ways that we can handle that by not disclosing some of those pertinent facts and details. If someone says, hey, look, my ex-husband is going to shoot me up if he finds out where I live, well, we're not going to share with them that person's address, if that makes any sense. There have been also times before, too, that tribunals have asked us, and I know Paul and I have done this, to make it seem like the case is happening in our diocese, but it really isn't happening in our diocese, so that our tribunal would send out questionnaires regarding the case so that it looked like it was coming from the Diocese of Baton Rouge, but the person was living in San Diego. And San Diego was actually handling the case. We did some of the grunt work for them to disguise the fact that this person doesn't live anywhere that you think that they're living at in order to protect them. It's not lying, it's just simply making sure that that person is protected and they're not vulnerable because of our processes. but they do have the right to participate. I think the best thing to do in terms of working with couples, I find the best thing to do that disarms them is to tell the petitioner if there is at least some type of relationship and they can have a conversation, call before you submit the paperwork to the tribunal and tell them, hey, look, I'm undergoing this whole annulment thing because I really need this for my spiritual advantage, my spiritual well-being. I'm not trying to put your face in the mud. We're not trying to relive old harsh experiences, but I really need this to move on in my spiritual life. And it'd be nice if you participated or if you just simply told the tribunal, yeah, thanks, but no thanks, I'm not participating. I think that sometimes just having that conversation can do a lot of disarmament. Sometimes respondents get sort of out of sorts when they get a letter from the tribunal. It's the first time they've heard that this is going on and they react in sort of an ugly way. That's not necessarily a bad thing because oftentimes it's more ammunition for the case that we have. More often than not, I find that respondents just don't participate at all. They sort of shrug their shoulders and throw the letters in file 13. But regardless, I think that we play a part as the ministers in the ground in order to ask petitioners to sort of have conversations, if possible, with those respondents so that there can hopefully be something life-giving in terms of it. And remember that with the process of declaring nullity in a marriage, that if a person receives an annulment, it's valid for both parties, right? So that might also enable that person to freely marry in the church again in the future, should that person have an interest to do so. There's questions about what kind of cases is it? Do non-sacramental marriages require a formal case annulment? Not necessarily. However, we often process those in that way. Again, remember, every single one is unique, and we're going to ask some questions about the marriage itself to determine what's the most facile way to deal with it in the tribunal. We're going to look at questions about lack of form, undispensed impediments, whether or not you did your job and got some good juridic effect of your delegation. Did you dispense somebody that you couldn't dispense? Could this be handled by Pauline privilege, Petrine privilege, et cetera, et cetera? Those are the different questions that we're asking. But yes, non-sacramental marriages can be handled by a formal annulment case, but oftentimes they can be handled in another way too. For example, they can be handled maybe as a Pauline privilege case, depending on the situation of the marriage. We talked about what constitutes a sacramental, non-sacramental. Remember, sacramental marriages are between the baptized. Non-sacramental, everything else. For instance, marriages between two baptized Catholics or between two baptized Catholics and a non-Catholic, and those are just some different examples of the cases. I don't want to go into every single iteration of what that might look like, but again, every single case is unique. You might just want to put in your mind sort of a pecking order or some questions to ask people that approach you about receiving an annulment. The ones that I always ask are these very generic ones. Was the marriage subject to canonical form? So is there a Catholic party involved? And if so, did they get married in the church or have that dispensed if they did not? Why? Lack of form cases are easy things for you to process. Ask questions about legamen. So if you have a lot of non-baptized or non-Catholic folks, ask the question, okay, so you were married before. Was your previous spouse married before marrying you? Because that could be a legamen case that's proven by documentary evidence. Ask questions about the baptismal status of the parties, because again, if you have two non-baptized persons and there's a possibility of conversion, that could be handled as a Pauline privilege. And if you ask a lot of just delegation questions, impediment questions, sometimes you can find something to latch onto that'll make life a little bit easier than having to jump into the formal annulment route. Dare I say, I also should probably mention the processus brevior. You might remember that Pope Francis talked about this whole process, the briefer process or the bishop's process, depending on how you translate the Latin. It's the idea of sort of having co-petitions, that you have a petitioner or respondent who basically agree that a marriage is invalid, and they basically agree on the substance of the invalidity. They can perhaps approach a tribunal or a bishop and ask that a more brief process happen. Paul and myself, when it first came out, Bishop Munch was bishop, he wanted to try a couple of those, and we did. We found a couple of them that met the standards, and we processed them. And what we realized is the processus brevior is not that brevior. It's not that brief. because you have to have the intervention of different parties doing different things. What we found is that the changes that Francis made to the annulment process period made our formal cases spend less time in our tribunal. And as a result, it's just as easy to get a normal formal case done as it would be to be a briefer process case. I think the briefer process, the bishop's process, whatever you want to call it, it's probably more of an advantage in the third world or in areas that don't have formal tribunals and staffs to process these. It'd make it much more expedient for those folks to be able to receive an annulment than it would in situations such as our own. So I just throw that out there. Don't really pay too much attention to that. So I got another question coming in the chat. Is it typical for the tribunal to have petitioners to come before them for the tribunal to question them? It's a good question. So it depends on the tribunal, right? Most of our interrogatories or questionnaires that are sent out previously. However, there are times where there might be oral interrogatories. In the past, because of the standard of proof before Pope Francis made some changes to the annulment process, we did have more oral interrogatories where we would invite people to come in and clarify some of their written statements. I did a lot of those when I first became a canon lawyer. I did many of the trials, if you will, or the questionnaires verbally in the tribunal itself. Those have become rarer because of the lowering of the standard of proof. However, there are times that we often have to get someone to come in to clarify their statements. And it could be just simply to give us some better clarity about what they said, but oftentimes you might have petitioner, witnesses, respondent who've told you a whole variety of different stories, right? You know, the old adage for canon lawyers, ask 2 canon lawyers an opinion, you get 3 opinions. Well, sometimes you got to work your way through that, right? You got to work your way through the different stories of what's being told to kind of come to some truth or to see if there are any contradictions and things of that nature. So yes, there are some oral interrogatories that happen, but they're not as frequent as they used to be. Another question, are we able to find out the status of cases, where they stand, and maybe how much longer? Yes and no. I'm going to answer it in that way. Yes, if you call our friendly tribunal, they're more than happy to sort of kind of tell you where things are going on. No, in that don't be a pest and call every other day to ask what's happening with the case. If there is a case that seems to be dragging out a little bit longer and you're thinking to yourself, gosh, it's been in tribunal a while, let me kind of see what's going on and maybe if there's a way I can help, I think that would be invited by the tribunal staff. But don't be one of those cusses that constantly calls up every 5 seconds and say, haven't got the annulment back, where's that? Want to know where it's at? I think that you will win the ire of Eileen, and you do not want to win the ire of Eileen in the tribunal, do you? Deacon Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Father. Father, what has happened to the workload of the tribunal since the Holy Father's modifications? That's one question. Secondly, I understand now there's no automatic referral to the Metropolitan. If there are appeals, where do they go? Have we had any appeals that have emanated since the change in the regulations that the Pope offered?
Awesome questions. To the first, what's happened in terms of workload volume? When Pope Francis promulgated Medius Judex, he did so, I believe it was on the Feast of the Assumption. And then he said all this was going to take place on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. And we looked at each other and said, oh my gosh, we've got like 4 months. Help, what are we going to do? We sat, we digested it a little bit, and then we prepared for the onslaught of what was going to happen. We did notice in the first, say, year and a half, 2 years, that there was a great increase in the number of cases. And part of that, I think, is just the media coverage that it got, right? People were talking about it very freely. Annulments are easier to get. It's not as difficult as it used to be. And a lot of people approached the church so that we could work on it. I think we did a very good job, and we were pretty effective and efficient in order to get those out. And then over the passage of time, eventually sort of regularized again. And so now we're sort of back at the standard of doing the normal caseload that we usually do. COVID has affected us a little bit too. Throw that one in there as well, because not as many people are perhaps approaching clergy right now in terms of it, but things are sort of regularizing a little bit more. I don't know about your parishes. I know here we have 7 folks in RCIA. The most wonderful thing that happened to us was that not a one of them had a marriage issue at all, which was like manna from heaven. That also means that next year payback is going to be hell because we'll have every single person with every single marriage issue that we'll have to work through. The second question that Deacon Dan asked was about the whole process and procedural law issues. Remember that in the past, every single one of our decisions were appellate, so that they had to go to a secondary tribunal to look at whether or not we applied the jurisprudence correctly and we followed procedure correctly. So if we gave an affirmative decision in Baton Rouge, our appellate tribunal was in the Archdiocese of New Orleans in their second instance court, and they would have to look over the case as well. You can imagine that's 6 months usually of more and more stuff that Pope Francis basically eliminated. The provision, I guess, in the law is basically this for Pope Francis. You have competent people that are working in the tribunal, and you trust these folks. These are clerics typically, or good lay persons that have some involvement in the church. Do you really need to second guess whether or not they're applying the law judiciously in terms of these particular cases? So the automatic appeal feature, if you will, sort of went away. Now in our cases, once we, in first instance, give a decision in the affirmative, parties have 15 days after notification, 15 useful days, to be able to lodge an appeal in that particular case. So they would have to make that appeal in writing to a secondary tribunal. Usually it's done by contacting the first instance tribunal, and then it could go either to our appellate tribunal, which is still the second instance court in New Orleans, or it can go to a higher grade of court, the Roman Rota, for example, if they wanted to appeal directly to the Rota. You can imagine after the changes happened, the number of appeals went down to almost nothing. We have had a couple of appeals that have happened, usually respondents that disagree either with the fact of that they've approached the church for an annulment at all, or sometimes just because this is the last way of getting back at their ex-spouse, and they're going to use everything in the arsenal to possibly do it. We've had a couple that have gone to the Rota itself, and every single time we get one that comes back from the Rota, we're like, ooh, finally, they're all gone from Rome. There's another one that ends up getting lodged back over there. We had one that I heard that was way back even before Medes came out that we finally got back from Rome. What was very interesting in that one was that they agreed with this judge's jurisprudence and practices all at one time, which you don't see that often from the Roman courts. It shows a little bit of change, I think, in the theology, the style of what they're about. So those organs are still there. I think, though, in praxis, a lot of the personnel devoted to second instance tribunals in those dioceses were moved now to their first instance tribunals. So I can imagine in New Orleans, now they have a lot of help to be able to deal with their own local issues instead of worrying about all the provincial issues around Louisiana.
Father, thank you. I had one follow-up with respect to preparation. How, in your experience and in the experience of my brother deacons, how has engaged encounter been handled now since COVID?
Yeah, so that one's been interesting. Daryl and Marriage and Family Life has been doing some interesting and wonderful work in terms of sort of standardizing what our marriage prep policies and programs should look like. For a while, there wasn't a lot going on in terms of in-person interaction. And instead, people were doing marriage prep with like CatholicMarriagePrep.com and some of these other places. Nowadays, the Office of Marriage and Family Life is offering a lot of it virtually, and I think very successfully. The feedback that I hear from a lot of the couples is, "Ooh, we don't have to go spend time in a room with somebody else that we don't know at the Life Center." We kind of like that. And so they've been doing a lot of the virtual stuff. I think with COVID, there's some curses and benefits, but one of the benefits is that we can do this type of ministry, and it's actually pretty good and pretty successful if you engage in it online. So kudos to them to be able to do it. And I think that even post-COVID, some of those same things they're gonna continue on in some sense.
Thank you, Father.
Thank you, Richard.
Okay, so not to endure the wrath of Eileen, because that is very good. That is very good practice for everyone if you do not know Eileen. She sent back to me a case that I had given her last week, I guess it was, for two people who live in Lafayette. And she said it would be best for them to do that in Lafayette. Okay, that's fine. Not knowing what the process is in Lafayette, is it very similar to ours or very different? Or can they just pretty much give what we did and say, run with it? Because I know New Orleans is very different from what we do, but I have no idea about Lafayette or anybody else.
Yeah, every tribunal is a little bit quirky, right? So Richard brings a couple of things to the front. First is the question of competence. Remember, there's a pecking order about a tribunal being able to hear a case. So we can hear cases for those marriages that took place in our domicile within the Diocese of Baton Rouge, or if it's the place where the petitioner resides, or if it's the place where the respondent resides, or if it's the place of the most proofs. That's a kind of squirrely one that I don't want to get into. But based on what Deacon Richard said, two persons are domiciled in Lafayette, so therefore Lafayette is competent to hear it, unless the wedding took place in Baton Rouge, which I'm assuming it did.
It didn't.
What I would do in that case is contact their staff, their judicial vicar, and simply see, would he allow you to be a case sponsor in their tribunal, which is an important question to ask, and then B, whether or not the standards that we set forth in our own tribunal would be applicable to them. I find that most tribunals would probably make you fill out their own libellus or form, the initial information form, which you've got most of the information on it anyway, right? In terms of the testimony itself, the questionnaires, I don't want to speak for them, but I find it's less about formatting and questions and more about substance of the story they tell. So as long as the information that's being given is substantive to help determine what a ground of nullity could be, I think that would be okay. We've had the same thing in Baton Rouge, right? Sometimes people will come to Baton Rouge and say, done all this work in New Orleans, but I live in Baton Rouge, help. And we just kind of review the paperwork with them and see if they have what we need in order to make it happen. But that's a case-by-case basis. So who is their judicial vicar now in Lafayette? I can get you his name and number and you can call him.
Well, I had the guy reach out to his priest who actually did a pastor's affidavit for him.
Mm-hmm.
So I just had him reach out to that church and hopefully they'll
pick up and take
have somebody that can do it. So
great. I've got a chat question that came in. What's the methodology for putting restrictions on on an individual from entering into another marriage? This is a great question too. The whole question of the monitum and the vetitum. You'll probably see that language sometimes in the final decree that comes out from the tribunal, that there is a restriction placed upon one or both parties in a marriage. One is called a monitum, one is a vetitum. The monitum is the less serious one. Usually it's sort of a red flag, a warning that we want priest, deacon, preparers to know about and to discuss with the couple before a couple enters marriage anew. Vetitum is a little bit more serious. It's more of a stringent prohibition that, there's some serious issues. This person might need to undergo some type of therapy, some psychological counseling before they enter marriage anew. In the past, the law would dictate that certain cases had to have a prohibition attached to them. So if it were a case that involved a psychological ground with perpetuity and severity, there would have to be one of those prohibitions that are attached to it. It's really at the discretion of the judge what it looks like. And in the past also, what was kind of fascinating was that when it went to a second instance court, they could also apply those vetitum and monitum to the particular case. But really, it just depends on the severity of what's being discussed as the ground in the case. So judges will do that sort of as a way to warn persons that are about to enter into another marriage again. You really need to address these things first before you go and complicate your life and somebody else's life by entering into a second marriage. And with that, I see no more hands. And I don't see any questions, but are there any other hands or questions of things? I think these were all good. Oh, I got more hands. I got a Deacon Tim hand.
Yeah, quickly, you said earlier that a deacon or a priest has the authority to grant a dispensation for subjects in their territory. Mm-hmm. But if they're not, they can. Is that an either or? Or both? So if you have one subject, one of the bride of the groom is in your territory, but the other is not, are you authorized to grant that dispensation?
It depends on the particular permission or dispensation that you're talking about and what party you're talking about, right? Because usually the persons that are subject to ecclesiastical law are the Catholic parties. So if the Catholic party is a party to the Diocese of Baton Rouge, then as a deacon, you would have the permission to issue that dispensation.
Okay.
what else? Clear as mud, right?
Covered a lot. Covered a lot. And we never, Father counts as sarcasm. You weren't sarcastic. You were pretty straightforward, you know.
I was trying to wrestle through them to do it kind of quickly too. It's interesting because, you know, we are all different personalities that have the canon law degrees, and we all answer things a little bit differently. I'll give you a warning though. Don't try to pit mom against dad. Okay. I know that there are some people out there that'll go out and ask mom, go ask Father Counts, can I do this? And if they don't like the answer, then they're going to come to dad. They're going to come to Father Jamin and say, can I do this? Do know that we copy each other on all of our responses to these questions so that we are of one mind and one heart, so that when some subversive deacons try to come in and pit us against one another, we are on the same page with one another. So just a warning that that's going on behind the scenes.
If we learn anything tonight, learn that. That's what I get out of that. So. Good.
This was an excellent briefing, Father. Superb, and thanks to the diaconate office for setting it up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Father. I think it's been very informative, and I'm glad we recorded. I think it'll be helpful to have that, you know, I'm sure a lot of us will go back and kind of review this and kind of refresh our memories on the things that didn't stick. So,
and look, thanks for your ministry too, you know, on behalf of the tribunal, but then on the church too as well. Deacons provide an invaluable service to all of us. And I think that by you going out in the trenches and meeting with people who need annulments that you work with in RCIA and other pastoral forums, that's really good help to all of us, to priests, but to the local church. Somebody asked me the other day, we were doing statistics, you know, the number of our marriages in the church continues to decline. But I think that it's going to be the common work of all of us together in evangelization and doing the ministry that you're doing that's going to change that and hopefully bring people back to our church. So I applaud you on that and for taking the time to deal with some of the difficulties of annulments in marriages.
Hey, Deacon Tim.
Yes, sir.
Can you take that part out where he said deacons are invaluable and just make that a clip and send it to me, please?
Say it to my deacons all the time at St. Margaret.
We will remind our parishioners. We'll cut that out and we'll put that up on the St. Margaret webpage. You know, so.
Can you also edit out subversive deacons? That's pretty strong, man.
Well, thanks to everybody for joining tonight. Again, Father, thank you. I'm amazed how you kind of rattle it off. I'm assuming you don't have any paper in front of all this coming out of your head. So we appreciate that. I'll get on an email once we get this posted to the website. I'll get on an email so you know where it is and send it out to all the deacons, of course, even, you know, including the ones who weren't here as well. So, again, thanks for joining, and y'all have a wonderful evening. Look forward to seeing y'all soon.
Thanks. Call if y'all need anything.
Good night.
Bye.